Welcome to a world that shouldn't exist. Imagine you are floating in the absolute silence of the outer solar system, 500 million miles from the sun, and ahead of you drifts a pale, frozen pearl. It is the smoothest object in the entire solar system. From a distance, it looks like a masterpiece of white glass reflecting the distant sunlight with a brilliance that makes it shine like a diamond against the infinite black void. There are no jagged mountain ranges tearing into the sky. There are no massive ancient impact basins. It is an unnervingly clean, polished marble. But in the cold, unyielding logic of space, perfection is a warning. You see, every other moon in our neighborhood is a battered graveyard. Our own moon is covered in the scars of 1 billion years of violence, its surface a chaotic record of every asteroid that ever dared to cross its path. Mercury is a bruised, airless rock. Even Mars carries the deep, pockmarked history of its ancient collisions. But Europa refuses to remember the past. As you draw closer, the piece of that smooth surface begins to feel like a disguise. If you were standing on that surface right now, the first thing you would notice isn't the beauty, it's the profound, heavy stillness. But as a student of the universe, this stillness should make you uncomfortable, because in space nothing stays perfect for billions of years without a reason. If a world looks new but you know it is ancient, it means something is actively erasing the history of the stars. It means that right beneath your boots, something is constantly rewriting the surface. Europa isn't just a moon, it is a mask. And today, we're going to look behind that mask to understand why this is the scariest place in the solar system. When you first step onto the surface, the reality of Europa hits you with a violence that no photograph can convey. The temperature is minus 160 degrees Celsius. It is a level of cold so absolute that it changes the very nature of matter. Water doesn't act like ice here, it acts like granite. If you try to drive a spike into the ground, it wouldn't crunch. It would ring like metal. This ice is so hard it could shatter steel like glass. And yet, despite this armor of frozen rock, the surface is shattered. You aren't standing on a solid world, you are standing on a ceiling. Beneath you is 18 miles of this granite hard ice, and beneath that is an abyss that contains more liquid water than all of Earth's oceans combined. We call it the polished mirror, but as you look down at your feet, you see that the mirror is covered in veins. These are the lineae, long, dark, reddish-brown fractures that stretch for thousands of kilometers, crossing and recrossing the moon like scars that refuse to heal. They aren't random scratches, they are organized, they are structured. They are the fingerprints of a process that has been unfolding in the dark for 4 billion years. Scientists have spent decades staring at these lines, trying to understand how a world this cold could be this active. On most moons, the internal engine died out eons ago, leaving them as static frozen relics. But Europa is restless. It refuses to be still. When we sent the Galileo spacecraft to take a closer look, what we found was a geological nightmare. In regions we now call chaos terrain, the surface looks like it was put into a blender. Imagine entire sections of ice, the size of cities being broken apart, rotated, shifted sideways, and then frozen back together in a jumbled, discordant arrangement. It looks like a jigsaw puzzle that was thrown into the air and allowed to settle back into place, while the glue was still wet. This kind of disruption is impossible If the moon is solid all the way through, solid ice on top of solid rock doesn't move like that. It doesn't drift. It doesn't rotate. The only way for city-sized blocks of ice to move is if they are floating. The ground you're standing on is a thin, fractured shell sitting on top of a global ocean that never sleeps. But the true horror of Europa isn't the water. It's the force that keeps it liquid. You're 5 times farther from the sun than Earth is. Out here, the sun is just a bright, cold star that provides no meaningful heat. By all the rules of physics, Europa should be a dead, frozen ball of ice from its surface to its core. But it has a secret benefactor. As you look up from the ice, you see the monster that rules this system. Jupiter, a planet so massive that its gravity doesn't just hold Europa in orbit, it reaches inside the moon and kneads it like a piece of clay. Because Europa's orbit isn't a perfect circle, the distance between the moon and the planet is constantly changing. Every 3.5 days, Jupiter pulls Europa in, stretching its entire structure, and then releases it as it swings away. This is tidal heating. Think of a metal paperclip. If you bend it back and forth quickly, the metal at the hinge gets hot. Now imagine that happening to an entire world. The friction of billions of tons of ice and rock rubbing against each other generates a terrifying amount of internal energy. This is why the ocean exists. It isn't warmed by light. It is warmed by the violent, relentless work of gravity. Europa is being physically tortured by its parent planet, and that internal friction is the only thing preventing it from becoming a tomb of solid ice. This constant stretching is what creates the acoustic nightmare that most people ignore. When competitors describe Europa, they talk about a silent moon, but they are wrong. If you were standing there, your suit would be vibrating with the sounds of a world under extreme stress. The 18 miles of ice above the ocean act as a massive crystalline microphone. Every time Jupiter's gravity stretches the moon, the ice crust moans and groans. Massive fractures, hundreds of miles long, grind against each other with the sound of 1,000 thunderstorms muffled by a mountain of glass. Beneath your feet, the ocean is churning, building pressure that screams through the fractures. The red stains you see in the cracks, the lineae, are not just mineral deposits, they are the evidence of the moon breathing. These fractures are the points where the internal pressure becomes so great that the ocean actually forces its way toward the surface, bringing up salts and chemicals from the abyss. Europa isn't a silent rock. It is a world that is constantly groaning under the weight of its own existence. And then there is the biological lock-in. This is the terrifying reality of exploration on this moon. We often dream of drilling through the ice to see what's inside, but we forget that Europa is a self-healing system. The same mechanism that erases impact craters, the constant upwelling of warmer material, means that any hole we make is a temporary wound. If a probe or a human were to break through that 18-mile ceiling and enter the water, the surface would begin to rewrite itself in a geological heartbeat. The ice would freeze shut behind you, sealing the exit with a layer of granite-hard ice that would take years to drill back through. You wouldn't just be in an ocean, you would be in a cage that hasn't seen a single ray of sunlight in 4 billion years. On Earth, if you are lost at sea, you can at least look at the stars. On Europa, there is no sky. There is only the ceiling. an endless, unbroken expanse of ice stretching for thousands of miles in every direction, cutting you off from the rest of the universe. This isolation is why the polished mirror is so unsettling. When we look at those long red veins, we are looking at the only connection between two completely different worlds. Above the ice, you have a radioactive hellscape. Europa sits directly in the firing line of Jupiter's magnetosphere. The radiation on the surface is so intense that it would fry your electronics and unravel your DNA in a matter of hours. It is a place of absolute death. But just a few miles below that frozen barrier, you have a stable, warm, salty ocean that has existed for longer than complex life has been on Earth. The ice isn't just a barrier, it's a shield. It protects the ocean from the radiation of Jupiter and the cold of the vacuum. This creates a paradox. The surface is the only place we can see, but it is the most lethal place in the system. The ocean is the most promising place for life, but it is the most hidden. Every crack and ridge you see is a message from that hidden world. When the ice pulls apart, it isn't just making a line, it's offering a sample. We have observed massive plumes of water vapor erupting from the South Pole, reaching 200 kilometers into the blackness of space. This means the moon is leaking its secrets. The ocean is under so much pressure from the tidal flexing of Jupiter that it occasionally bursts through the 18-mile lid. This is our only chance to taste the abyss without being locked inside it. But what is that taste telling us? The red material in the cracks contains salts and carbon compounds. It tells us the ocean is chemically active. It tells us that this isn't just a dead tank of water, it's a living, churning chemical reactor. As you stand on the polished mirror, looking at your own reflection in the ice, you have to confront the most terrifying question of all. If the surface is a disguise and the moon is constantly erasing its own history, what is it trying to hide? Why is it so important that we never see the scars of the past? On Earth, we use craters to tell time. On Europa, time is a circle. The ice melts, it shifts, it refreezes, and it becomes new again. It is a world that refuses to age, a world that stays young by consuming its own surface. And as the vibrations of the grinding ice travel through your boots, you realize that the sound isn't just geology, it's a warning. All these worlds are yours except Europa, because once you break the mirror, there is no way back. The polished mirror is the only thing keeping the abyss where it belongs. And as we prepare to send our machines to taste those plumes and peer into those cracks, we have to ask ourselves, are we ready to see what's looking back at us through the glass? Europa is the scariest moon because it is the only world that seems to be actively protecting itself. It guards its ocean behind 18 miles of granite ice. It surrounds itself with a lethal field of radiation. And it erases every mark we try to leave on it. It is a world that wants to remain a mystery, but the cracks are widening, the plumes are rising, the polished mirror is starting to fail, and beneath the ice in a darkness that has never known the sun, something is waiting. It has been waiting for billions of years, and soon we will finally have to answer the question, if Europa is a cage, what happens when we finally unlock the door? If you look up from the fractured, frozen plains of Europa, you won't see a sky that offers any sense of peace or familiarity. You will see the king of planets, a monster of gravity and magnetism, that dominates the horizon, like a god that demands a constant sacrifice. Jupiter is so massive that it doesn't just hold Europa in its grip. It is actively, violently trying to pull it apart. This is what scientists call the monster's grip, a deadly dance between a gas giant and its frozen moon that has been unfolding in the dark for over 4 billion years. From where you stand, Jupiter isn't a distant point of light. It is a swirling, chaotic wall of storms that fills the sky, its great red spot looking down on you like a lidless, judgmental eye. But the true terror of this relationship isn't the view. It's the invisible force that is currently reaching inside the moon and kneading it like a piece of dough. To understand why Europa is the scariest moon in the solar system, you have to understand that it is caught in a gravitational tug-of-war that it can never win. Europa does not orbit Jupiter in a perfect, peaceful circle. Instead, its path is slightly stretched, an elliptical loop that brings it closer to the monster and then flings it further away every 3.5 days. But Europa isn't alone in this dance. It is trapped between Jupiter and its sibling moons, Io and Ganymede. Every time Europa tries to settle into a stable orbit, the gravity of these other massive worlds tugs at it, keeping its path slightly off balance. This constant gravitational interference ensures that the stress on Europa never stops. It is a system designed to keep the moon in a state of perpetual internal agony. Imagine taking a metal paperclip and bending it back and forth, faster and faster, until the metal at the hinge begins to warm up. If you do it long enough, that metal will eventually become so hot it could burn your skin. Now, scale that idea up to the size of a world. As Europa moves along its elliptical path, Jupiter's immense gravity pulls on the moon with varying strength. When it is close, the planet's pull is so strong that it physically stretches the entire moon, distorting its shape. As it moves away, the force weakens and the moon snaps back. This constant, rhythmic stretching and compressing is what scientists call tidal heating, but that term is far too clinical for the violence it describes. Deep inside Europa, billions of tons of rock and ice are rubbing against each other with unimaginable friction. The interior is being kneaded with such force that the core itself may be glowing with heat generated by nothing but the silent, relentless work of gravity. This internal kneading is the reason the polished mirror surface from Chapter 1 is constantly cracking and resetting. The heat rising from the core keeps the 100-kilometer deep ocean liquid, but it also builds up immense pressure that must go somewhere. Every groan you would hear vibrating through your boots is the sound of the moon's internal organs being shifted and squeezed by the planet above. The heat isn't just warming the water, it is powering a geological engine that has stayed active for billions of years, long after other moons in the solar system have grown cold and dead. It is a world that is being kept alive by a process of physical torture. Without Jupiter's monster grip, Europa would be a tomb of solid ice, but with it, the moon becomes an active, churning, and potentially predatory environment. However, the same gravity that gives Europa life also creates a surrounding environment that is a literal radioactive hellscape. As you stand on the surface, looking up at that massive striped planet, you are standing in the middle of an invisible fire. Jupiter spins at a dizzying speed, completing a rotation in less than 10 hours. This rapid spin generates a magnetic field so powerful it is thousands of times stronger than Earth's. This field acts like a giant cosmic particle accelerator, trapping high-energy radiation and hurling it outward into space at nearly the speed of light. Unfortunately for any future explorer, Europa orbits directly inside this firing line. The radiation levels on the surface of Europa are not just dangerous, they are an assault on the very definition of matter. If you were standing there unprotected, the radiation dose would be approximately 5.4 sieverts per day. To put that in perspective, a single sievert is enough to cause severe radiation sickness in a human, and 5 sieverts in a single day is a death sentence. This radiation is an invisible, silent killer that would fry your electronics, melt your camera lenses into static, and begin to unravel the double helix of your DNA before you could even realize you were in danger. It is an environment where the very building blocks of life are torn apart by the magnetospheric fury of the king of planets. This is the great paradox of Europa. The moon is shielded by 18 miles of ice that protects the ocean below, but the surface itself is a graveyard. The radiation is so intense that it splits water molecules apart, creating reactive chemicals and oxidants that stain the ice in those long red veins we see from orbit. In a strange twist of fate, this lethal radiation might actually be the food that supports life in the abyss. As the surface churns and the chaos terrain rotates, these radiation-borne chemicals are slowly dragged down through the ice, a natural conveyor belt that delivers energy from the radioactive hellscape above to the dark, waiting ocean below. But don't let the idea of delivery fool you into thinking the surface is a gateway. For anything living above, the environment is a nightmare of absolute isolation. You are caught between a planet that is trying to crush you with gravity and an atmosphere that is trying to shred your atoms with radiation. The surface of Europa is not a place for us. It is a world where the laws of biology are suspended in favor of the laws of extreme physics. Think about the sheer scale of the energy being pumped into this moon. Jupiter's grip is so strong that it creates enough internal heat to melt trillions of tons of ice into a global abyss that is 10 times deeper than the Mariana Trench. This is not a gentle warming. It is a violent, friction-based survival. As the moon flexes, the ice shell moans and the ocean currents are driven by internal heat gradients, creating a world that is restless, shifting, and deeply unpredictable. The deadly dance is what keeps the water liquid, but it also ensures that the world of Europa is never at rest. The deeper we look at this monster grip, the more we realize that Europa is a world divided by a frozen wall. Above the ice is the radioactive hellscape, a place of high-speed particles and genetic destruction. Below the ice is the dark abyss, a place of warmth, high pressure, and total isolation. The gravity of Jupiter is the bridge between them, the force that makes the ocean possible while simultaneously making the surface a place of death. As you stand there, feeling the deep frequency thuds of the internal kneading vibrating through your suit, you realize that the silence of the vacuum is a lie. The moon is shouting. It is screaming under the pressure of a planet that refuses to let it go. And in that screaming, in that violent internal friction, the conditions for something extraordinary are being created. Because where there is heat, and where there is water, and where there is a constant input of energy from a gravitational monster, there is the potential for something to emerge. But as the radiation begins to fry your sensors and the gravity continues its rhythmic stretching of the very ground you stand on, you have to ask yourself, if this is what the monster's grip does to the ice, what has it done to the things that might be living in the dark below? If the energy that powers this moon is born from violence, what kind of life does that violence produce? Jupiter is not just a planet in the sky of Europa. It is the reason the moon is alive, and it is the reason we may never be able to truly touch its surface without being destroyed. The deadly dance continues, orbit after orbit, century after century, a relentless kneading of a world that was never meant to be seen by human eyes. And as the red eye of Jupiter stares down at the fractured mirror of Europa, the secret of what lives under that ice remains protected by the very monster that created it. We used to think the scariest thing about the outer solar system was the cold. But on Europa, the heat is what should terrify you, because that heat is the mark of a system that is under a pressure we cannot comprehend. It is the evidence of a world that is being kept awake by a force that would crush us in an instant. The monster grip of Jupiter is the lifeblood of Europa, but it is a blood that runs hot with friction and radiation, creating a hidden paradise that is guarded by a radioactive hellscape. As the vibrations of the next tidal stretch begin to rattle your equipment, you realize that the clock is ticking. You cannot stay here. The radiation is unraveling your cells, and the moon is preparing to flex again. The mask of the polished mirror is starting to look less like a pearl and more like a cage, and the monster above is the one who holds the key. But if the surface is too lethal to explore, and the ice is too thick to drill, how do we ever hope to see what's inside? The answer might not involve going down at all, because the same pressure that keeps the ocean liquid is also looking for a way out. And in the next chapter, we're going to look at the moments when the moon finally breaks, when Europa stops hiding and begins to breathe. Imagine standing at the foot of a wall that doesn't just block your path but dominates your entire existence. For decades, the greatest minds in planetary science were locked in a heated debate about what exactly lay beneath the fractured skin of Europa. Some argued for a thin ice model, a fragile shell only a few kilometers deep that might easily crack and allow us to peer into the abyss. They wanted to believe the ocean was reachable, almost inviting. But in January 2025, the debate was silenced by a cold, hard reality. Data from the Juno spacecraft's 2022 flyby, specifically from its microwave radiometer, confirmed a terrifying new scale. The ice shell of Europa isn't a thin veil, it is a gargantuan 29-kilometer thick barrier. That is 18 miles of solid, rigid, frozen water standing between the surface of the moon and the liquid dark below. To put that into perspective, the deepest point in Earth's oceans, the Mariana Trench, is only 11 kilometers deep. If you were to stack the deepest point of our world on top of itself 2.5 times, you would still be trapped within the frozen ceiling of Europa. This isn't ice as we understand it on Earth. At minus 160 degrees Celsius, this water has been transformed into a material as hard as granite and as sharp as a razor. It doesn't crunch, it rings like metal. This is the 18-mile ceiling, a permanent planetary lid that's been bolted shut for eons. This thickness changes everything about how we perceive this moon. It is no longer just a world with an ocean. It is a world that has been buried alive. The Juno mission confirmed the thick ice model, and with it, a heavy implication for any life that might exist there. This 18-mile barrier is a formidable fortress. While Juno detected small cracks and pores in the near-surface ice, those fractures only extend a few hundred meters down. They are nothing more than superficial scratches on a mountain. They don't even come close to touching the liquid water 18 miles below. This means that the ocean is deeply, profoundly isolated. It is cut off from the stars, cut off from the sun, and cut off from the very vacuum of space. For longer than complex life has existed on Earth, this water has been trapped in a closed system. It is a volume of water that has existed in total isolation, never seeing a single ray of sunlight in 4 billion years. Think about what that isolation truly means. On Earth, the ocean is a breathing lung connected to the atmosphere, the sun, and the seasonal cycles of our planet. But on Europa, the geometry of the world is a trap. If you are somehow transported into that ocean, you would immediately realize that direction has lost its meaning. There is no sky above you. There is no surface to swim toward to find air or light. In every direction, for thousands of miles, there is only an endless, unbroken ceiling of ice. You are suspended in a place that was never built for human perception. The isolation hook is the realization that this isn't just water in the dark. It is a place that has had billions of years to become something entirely its own. It has developed its own internal logic, its own chemical history, and its own evolutionary path completely independent of the rest of the solar system. This 18-mile lid is the reason why Europa is the most inaccessible environment we have ever tried to study. It isn't just a physical distance, it's a conceptual barrier. When we look at those long red fractures on the surface, we used to hope they were windows, but the Juno data suggests they are more like scars on a thick vault. The ice shell behaves differently at different depths. The upper portion is fractured and dynamic, constantly bombarded by Jupiter's lethal radiation, which breaks apart water molecules and creates reactive chemicals. In theory, these chemicals could fuel life if they reach the water. But how do you move energy across 18 miles of granite-hard ice? Transporting anything across that distance is not simple, not fast, and possibly not efficient enough to matter. The deeper layers of ice remain stable and intact, forming a long-term barrier that isolates the ocean from the surface. This creates a terrifying psychological reality, the biological lock-in. Europa is a self-healing system. The same tidal forces that keep the ocean liquid are constantly pushing material upward to rewrite the surface. On any other world, a crater stays for 1 billion years. On Europa, the moon consumes its own history. This means that if we were to ever drill through that 18-mile ceiling, the wound would begin to heal almost immediately. The ice would freeze shut behind you, sealing the exit with a layer of ice that would take years to break through again. You wouldn't just be exploring an ocean, you would be entering a cage. We used to think the scariest thing about the darkness was that we couldn't see what was inside it. But the 18-mile ceiling suggests something worse. It suggests that the darkness is an absence of knowledge. Because that ocean is so perfectly shielded, it has been allowed to ferment in a stable, warm environment for periods of time that stretch far beyond human intuition. It has been a hidden world long before we ever thought to ask the question of its existence. While the surface is a radioactive hellscape of high-speed particles and genetic destruction, the ocean is protected. The ice shell acts as a massive shield, preserving whatever is inside from the chaos of the universe. As we look at the scale of this barrier, we have to confront the trap. If life exists in that dark abyss, it has evolved in complete separation from the surface. It has never experienced weather, never interacted with an atmosphere, and never seen the stars. It is an environment that is stable and long-lived, potentially providing the perfect conditions for something unexpected to happen. But the very thing that makes it stable, the 18-mile ceiling, is also the thing that makes it a mystery we may never fully solve. It is a world that guards its secrets behind layers of radiation and distance, making any attempt to understand it a challenge that pushes the limits of human capability. Standing on the surface today, you are standing on a boundary between two very different environments. Above you is the vacuum and the fire of Jupiter's magnetosphere. Below you is 29 kilometers of ancient, unyielding ice. And beneath that is the water. You are standing on the lid of the largest tomb, or the largest nursery in the solar system. The 18-mile ceiling isn't just geography, it's a statement. It tells us that Europa is not inviting us in. It tells us that whatever is happening in that dark ocean is intended to stay there. It is a closed system, a trapped volume of water that has been waiting in the dark for billions of years. And as the vibrations of the moon's internal kneading travel through that massive frozen shield, you realize that the silence isn't an absence of life. It's a sign that the door has been locked from the inside. The scariest thing about the 18-mile ceiling isn't that it's hard to break through. It's the realization that once you do, the universe you knew is gone, and you're entirely at the mercy of whatever has been growing in the dark for 4 billion years. In the vast, freezing vacuum of the outer solar system, there is a rule we've all been taught since childhood. In space, no one can hear you scream. We are told that the void is a place of absolute crushing silence, where sound cannot travel, because there is no air to carry the waves. For most of the cosmos, that rule is a sanctuary. But on Europa, the silence is a lie. If you were to land a probe on those pale frozen plains, you wouldn't just be looking for life with cameras or chemical sensors. You would be listening. And if the newest theories from the most obscure corners of planetary science are correct, what you would hear would be enough to make you want to leave the moon forever. Imagine a small metallic lander sitting alone in the dark, 500 million miles from home. The cameras show nothing but a white, glass-like horizon. But deep within the machine's sensors, a rhythmic, deep-frequency thud begins to resonate. Thud, thud, thud. It's not the wind because there is no air. It's not the lander's internal gears. It is the moon itself. It is a series of rhythmic, guttural shouts vibrating through 18 miles of ice from an abyss that has never seen the sun. Today we are going beyond what we can see to explore the acoustic nightmare of Europa, the sound of a world that is breathing, shifting, and perhaps screaming from the inside out. When we talk about the listening phenomena, we are moving into the most unsettling territory of the Europa mystery. For decades, we treated this moon as a visual puzzle, a world of cracks and colours that we could solve with photographs. But sound is a different kind of evidence. Sound implies movement. Sound implies a process that is happening right now, in this very second. The law vault suggests that the ice crust of Europa doesn't just act as a barrier, it acts as a massive, planetary-scale crystalline microphone. Because the ice is so cold, minus 160 degrees Celsius, it has become as hard as granite and as rigid as glass. In a material that dense and that cold, vibrations don't just dissipate, they travel. They echo. They amplify. A sound made at the bottom of a 100-kilometre deep ocean would travel upward, striking the bottom of the 18-mile ice ceiling, and then race through the frozen crust until it reached the surface. Imagine sitting in total darkness on that surface, with only the massive, striped face of Jupiter hanging above you. You expect the peace of the graveyard, but instead you feel a low-frequency hum vibrating through the soles of your boots. It's the sound of the moon being kneaded by the gravity of the king of planets. As Jupiter stretches Europa, billions of tons of ice are grinding against each other. This isn't the sound of a crack in a frozen pond. This is the sound of a mountain-sized sheet of ice sliding past another mountain-sized sheet of ice. The friction generates a screeching, groaning noise that would be deafening if there were an atmosphere to carry it. But even without air, the vibrations are there, turning the entire moon into a resonant chamber. This is where the listening phenomena becomes truly terrifying. In the hypothetical data from a subsurface acoustic lander, scientists describe hearing things that don't sound like shifting ice. They describe rhythmic thuds, sounds that repeat with a precision that feels almost intentional. On Earth, we hear similar things in our own oceans. We hear the rhythmic pulses of whale songs travelling for thousands of miles through the deep. We hear the bloop of shifting glaciers. But on Europa, these thuds are coming from beneath a ceiling of ice that's been closed for billions of years. If you were the one monitoring that lander, and you heard a deep frequency shout echoing up from the 100-kilometre abyss, would you call it geology? Or would you start to wonder if the silence of the surface is just a mask for a world that is very much alive and very, very loud? To understand the source of these sounds, we have to look at the visual evidence of the moon's voice, the lineae. To the naked eye from orbit, these look like simple red veins or scratches on a marble, but the science tells a far more dynamic story. These are not static scars. They are the points where the moon is literally breathing. The lineae are actual fractures in the 18-mile ceiling, places where the crust had been pulled apart by the monster's grip of Jupiter. Think of the moon as a living organism. When it orbits Jupiter, the planet's gravity pulls the ice open, and the ocean below, pressurized by that same gravity, rushes upward to fill the gap. This is the moment of the breathing cycle. As the water and slush from the abyss reach the surface, they encounter the vacuum of space. They freeze instantly, expanding and pushing outward, creating those raised, double-lined ridges that crisscross the moon for thousands of kilometers. The reddish-brown color that stains these cracks is the breath of the ocean, salts, minerals, and organic compounds that have been hidden in the dark for eons, finally being exhaled onto the surface. These lineae are the records of every time the moon has sighed, every time the pressure from below became too much for the frozen lid to hold. But breathing is a violent act on Europa. When a fracture opens, it isn't a gentle process. It is a planetary-scale rupture. The sound of a 1,000-kilometre-long crack opening would be a shout that resonates through the entire moon's structure. This is why the listening phenomena is so critical. The sounds we hear are the soundtrack of the moon's constant renewal. Every time we see a fresh red line on the surface, we are looking at the aftermath of a massive acoustic event, a moment where the ice screamed, the ocean rose, and the world changed. These successful transcripts often focus on the smoothness of Europa, but they rarely dive into the mechanics of that smoothness. The reason the moon has no craters isn't because it's lucky, it's because it's noisy and restless. The acoustic nightmare is part of the resurfacing engine. The constant vibrations and the kneading of the ice ensure that the surface is never allowed to settle into the permanence of death. In regions like the chaos terrain, the sound must be unimaginable. These are places where the 18-mile ceiling has been completely shattered into blocks that rotate and drift like icebergs in a slushy sea. The grinding of these city-sized blocks against each other would create a cacophony of deep-frequency vibrations that the law vault describes as signals traveling through the ice. But what if the signals aren't just from the ice? This is the question that haunts the listening phenomena. If you have a stable, warm, salty ocean that has existed for 4 billion years, and you have a crust that acts as a perfect transmitter for sound, any complex life in that ocean would almost certainly use acoustics to communicate. In the total darkness of the abyss, eyes are useless. Sonar, vibration sensing, and acoustic signaling would be the only way to navigate or hunt. The rhythmic thuds detected by our hypothetical lander might not be the shifting of ice. They could be the pings of something enormous moving in the 100-kilometre deep, using the ice ceiling as a sounding board to map its world. The terror of the 18-mile ceiling is that it works both ways. It keeps the ocean in, but it also traps the sound. The echoes of the abyss have nowhere to go but up into the ice. When we look at the red veins of the lineae, we are looking at the places where the internal pressure and the internal sound is most intense. These fractures are the mouths of the moon, and the fact that they are constantly shifting, opening and closing means that Europa is a world in a state of perpetual, noisy conversation with itself. We often think of exploration as a visual journey. We want to see the something that lives under the ice. We want a photograph of a creature near a hydrothermal vent. But on Europa, we might hear it long before we ever see it. We might land a probe, turn on the microphone, and realize that we aren't standing on a dead rock, but on the roof of a stadium filled with the sounds of a hidden civilization or a prehistoric ecosystem. The shouts from the abyss aren't just geological data. They are a warning. They tell us that the isolation of Europa is not the same as emptiness. The science of the lineae confirms this. These fractures are the proof that the moon is dynamic, active, and restless. They show us that the boundary between the surface we can see and the ocean we cannot is constantly being breached. The listening phenomena just gives that movement a voice. It turns the polished mirror into a screaming chamber. Every time the gravity of Jupiter stretches the moon, It is like a giant hand squeezing a wet sponge. The water is forced up, the ice is forced out, and the sound is forced through. As we prepare to send missions like the Europa Clipper, we are essentially sending ears to the moon. We are going to look for the plumes of water vapour that erupt 200 kilometres into space, the moon's exhalations. But the most important data might come from the moments of silence between the plumes. Because in those moments, we might finally hear the rhythmic, deep-frequency thuds that the law vault speaks of. We might finally realise that the something living under the ice isn't just surviving, it's communicating, it's moving, it's making its presence known through the very floor we are trying to walk on. Europa is the scariest moon because it is the only one that talks back. When you stand on the moon or Mars, the ground is a silent witness to a dead past. But on Europa, the ground is a living part of a churning, noisy present. The lineae are the fractures of a breathing world, and the sounds beneath the ice are the echoes of a mystery that is 4 billion years old. If you were sitting in that lander and the rhythmic thuds started to get louder, and the deep frequency shouts started to sound like they were moving closer to the surface, would you stay to see what was breathing through the cracks? Or would you realise that the 18-mile ceiling isn't just there to protect the ocean, it's there to muffle a world that we were never meant to hear? The mirror is cracked, the moon is breathing, and the abyss is loud. And as we continue to listen to the shouts from the deep, we have to face the ultimate psychological trigger. We are no longer the observers. In a world that transmits every vibration and every sound, we are the ones being listened to. The listening phenomena suggests that the moment we touch the ice, the entire ocean knows we are there. The thuds aren't just the moon moving, they might be a response, and in the next chapter, we are going to look at what happens when that response moves from sound to light, as we dive into the bioluminescent nightmares that may be waiting for us in the dark. Up until now, we have treated Europa's 18-mile ice ceiling as a barrier, a massive granite-hard vault designed to keep the universe out and the ocean in. We've looked at the surface as a radioactive graveyard and the abyss as a dark, lonely tomb, but there is a secret hidden in the chemistry of this moon that changes everything. It turns the scariest moon in the solar system into something far more active and far more disturbing. You see, the ocean below isn't just sitting there in the dark, waiting to be found. It is being fed. As you stand on those frozen, fractured plains, you're actually standing on the starting line of a planetary-scale conveyor belt, a system that captures the very energy that should be killing everything on the surface and drags it down into the deep to fuel a world we were never meant to see. Today we are following the lifeblood of Europa. We're going to understand how the oxygen conveyor belt turns a silent abyss into a chemically charged engine of life, and why the something living under the ice might be much larger and much hungrier than a simple microbe. To understand the feed, we have to look back up at the monster in the sky. As we've established, Jupiter's magnetosphere is an invisible fire, a region of space filled with high-energy particles moving at nearly the speed of light. On the surface of Europa, this radiation is lethal. It is an environment of absolute death that would fry your DNA in minutes. But in physics, energy is never truly lost. It is only transformed. When these high-energy particles slam into the ice of Europa's surface, they don't just destroy, they create. This process is called radiolysis. The radiation is so powerful that it physically rips the water molecules of the ice apart, breaking the bonds between hydrogen and oxygen. The light hydrogen gas escapes into the vacuum of space, but the heavier oxygen stays behind, trapped within the crystalline lattice of the frozen surface. Imagine the irony of this landscape. You are standing in a place where the air would kill you, but the very ground beneath your boots is becoming saturated with the one element that fuels complex life on Earth. Over millions of years, the top few meters of Europa's ice have become a concentrated reservoir of oxygen and reactive chemicals called oxidants. If Europa were a dead rock, this oxygen would stay locked at the surface forever, a useless treasure chest sitting on top of a radioactive mountain. But as we know, Europa is a moon that refuses to stay still. The surface is young because the moon is constantly consuming itself. This is where we encounter the chaos terrain, those nightmare regions where the ice looks like it was put through a blender. For a long time, we didn't understand why these city-sized blocks of ice were rotated and shifted, but now we see them for what they truly are. They are the entry points for the conveyor belt. In these regions, the internal heat from the ocean below softens the bottom of the 18-mile ice shell. This creates a slushy environment where the heavy, oxygen-rich ice from the surface begins to sink. It is a slow-motion collapse. A block of ice the size of Manhattan, saturated with 4 billion years of captured radiation energy, slowly tilts and descends through the crust, being dragged down by its own weight and the churning currents of the ocean below. This is the oxygen conveyor belt, and it is the most important discovery for the habitability of Europa. It means that the 18-mile ceiling isn't just a shield, it is a lung. The moon is breathing in the radiation of Jupiter, converting it into oxygen, and then swallowing that oxygen through the chaos terrain to feed the abyss. When that oxygen-rich ice finally reaches the bottom of the shell and melts into the liquid water, it changes the chemistry of the ocean forever. Most people assume that if there is life on Europa, it must be like the simple, primitive bacteria we find around hydrothermal vents on Earth. Tiny organisms huddling near the heat because they have no other choice. But on Earth, the only reason life evolved beyond simple microbes into complex creatures like fish, whales, and humans is because our atmosphere became rich with oxygen. Oxygen is the ultimate biological fuel. It allows for high metabolism lifestyles, and Europa's conveyor belt is delivering that fuel directly into a 100-kilometer deep dark tank. This is the implication that should keep you awake at night. This isn't just a dead, stagnant pond of water. It is a chemically rich, pressurized environment that has been receiving a steady feed of oxygen from above for billions of years. If you have heat from the core, water in the middle, and a constant delivery of oxygen from the top, you have the three ingredients for a biological supersystem. We have to stop thinking about microbes and start thinking about predators. On Earth, in the deepest parts of our own ocean, we find creatures that have evolved in total darkness. Squid with eyes the size of dinner plates, bioluminescent fish that lure prey with glowing lights, and massive sharks that can live for centuries. Now imagine that same evolutionary process, but on a moon where the ocean is 10 times deeper than ours and has been stable for twice as long as complex life has existed on our planet. The law vault suggests that the something living under the ice isn't just surviving, it's thriving. With the low gravity of Europa and the massive volume of water, there is no physical reason why the life there couldn't grow to enormous sizes. We could be looking at an ecosystem of apex predators of the dark, creatures that use the rhythmic thuds we discussed in the last chapter to hunt, navigating an ocean where they are the absolute masters. This chemical feed makes Europa the most dangerous place in the solar system for a different reason. It means the moon is charged. It is a planetary scale battery where the positive terminal is the radioactive surface, and the negative terminal is the rocky seafloor, and the ocean is the electrolyte that carries the current of life. Every time a new region of chaos terrain forms, the battery gets a fresh jolt of energy. The polished mirror from Chapter 1 isn't just a mask, it's a solar panel made of ice, capturing the fury of Jupiter and turning it into a buffet for the things that swim in the dark. The scariest part of the conveyor belt is the scale of the isolation, because the oxygen is being dragged down, but there is no easy way for anything to come back up. This is a one-way delivery system. The ocean is being pumped full of energy, but it is still sealed beneath 18 miles of granite ice. It is a pressurized pressure cooker of evolution. If an ecosystem has been developing in that oxygen-rich dark for 4 billion years, it won't look like anything we understand. It will be fundamentally alien, perhaps even unrecognizable as life to our current senses. When missions like the Europa Clipper arrive to taste the plumes, they aren't just looking for salt, they're looking for the chemical signatures of this conveyor belt. They are looking for the waste products of a world that is eating oxygen in the dark. If we find high concentrations of carbon dioxide or complex organics near those red lineae, it's a sign that the feed is working. It's a sign that the conveyor belt is successfully delivering the lifeblood of the surface to the monsters below. Europa is the scariest moon because it is a world that has solved the problem of darkness. It doesn't need the sun. It has found a way to use the very radiation that should have killed it to fuel an empire of the abyss. As you look down at the chaos terrain, don't just see broken ice. See a mouth that is slowly, perpetually swallowing the energy of the stars to feed something that's been waiting in the dark since the dawn of time. The conveyor belt is moving, the oxygen is sinking, and the something below is getting larger. In the next chapter, we are going to dive even deeper, past the 18-mile ceiling, past the oxygen-rich currents, and down to the very bottom of the 100-kilometer abyss, where the bioluminescent nightmares begin. Because if the ocean is being fed from above, it is being warmed from below. And in that meeting of heat and oxygen, the real terror of Europa is born. Imagine leaving the relative safety of the 18-mile ice ceiling and surrendering yourself to the weight of a world you were never meant to see. As you descend past the final jagged edge of the frozen lid, you enter a volume of water so vast it defies human measurement. On Earth, we talk about the midnight zone of our oceans as a place of extreme mystery, but the midnight zone on Earth begins just 1 kilometer down. On Europa, the darkness is not a zone, it is the entire reality of a 100-kilometer deep abyss. If you were to drop the highest mountain on Earth into this ocean, it would be swallowed whole, with 90 kilometers of water still pressing down above it. This is the Great Dark, an environment that has existed in absolute isolation for over 4 billion years, never touched by a single photon of sunlight. But as you sink deeper, past the 50-kilometer mark, the crushing pressure isn't the only thing you notice. The temperature, which should be near freezing, begins to shift. You are leaving the influence of the ice and entering the domain of the core. The descent through this 100-kilometer column of water is a journey through a planetary-scale tomb that slowly reveals itself to be a nursery. You are falling through more liquid water than exists in all of Earth's oceans combined. A salty, conductive medium that is being stirred by tidal currents and internal heat. As you approach the seafloor, the silence of the abyss is finally broken by a new kind of spectacle. Out of the eternal blackness, towering structures begin to emerge from the rocky mantle. These are the hydrothermal vents, the black smokers of Europa, spewing superheated, mineral-rich fluids into the freezing dark. On Earth, these vents are the oases of the deep, places where life thrives completely independent of the sun. But on Europa, they are the heart of a world that has had twice as much time as Earth to perfect the art of survival in the dark. You might expect the seafloor to be a place of volcanic violence, but recent evidence suggests a more subtle, perhaps more terrifying process is at work here. Serpentinization. In the deepest cracks of Europa's rocky core, seawater percolates into the stone, triggering chemical reactions that produce hydrogen gas and steady, persistent heat. This isn't the explosive energy of a volcano. It is a slow, rhythmic chemical breathing that can sustain an environment for billions of years without ever needing a spark from a star. This process creates a chemically active world where hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen, the oxygen dragged down from the surface by the conveyor belt, meet in a pressurized reactor. It is here, in this chemical meeting ground, that the abyss stops being a void and becomes an ecosystem. As you drift closer to these vents, you realize that the darkness of the seafloor is a lie. It isn't dark, it is filled with false stars. This is the bioluminescent abyss, a vision from the deepest reaches of the lore vault that suggests Europa's ocean is not a place of blindness, but of predatory light. Imagine entire forests of glowing, glass-like organisms clinging to the sides of the black smokers, pulsing with rhythmic flickers of neon blue and ghostly green. In an ocean where eyes have no sun to rely on, life has invented its own suns. But here, light is not used to see the world. It is used to manipulate it. This is Theory 1 from our deep lore research, the concept of an entire food chain built on the mechanics of the lure. Visualizing this world requires you to abandon everything you know about biology. In the 100-kilometer deep, bioluminescence isn't just a defensive flash. It is a language and a trap. You see constellations of floating jellyfish-like creatures whose long trailing tentacles glow with a soft, inviting warmth, designed to attract the smaller, chemically fed organisms that huddle around the vents. But the light is a deception. The moment a creature enters the glow, the stars go out, and the abyss claims another victim. This is a world of bioluminescent nightmares, where every spark of light you see is likely the last thing you would ever witness. The something that lives under the ice has had eons to evolve specialized sensors, using light to mimic the very chemical signals of the hydrothermal vents, drawing prey out of the safety of the heat and into the waiting mouths of the dark. The scale of this ecosystem is what makes it truly frightening. On Earth, our deep-sea vents are isolated islands in a desert of sand, but on Europa, the entire moon is a single, interconnected ocean floor. The tidal heating of Jupiter ensures that this chemical engine never shuts down. As the monster's grip kneads the moon's core, it keeps the cracks in the seafloor open, ensuring that the serpentinization and the black smokers continue to pump lifeblood into the water. This means the bioluminescent forests aren't just small patches, they could be planetary-scale networks of light and hunger. Beneath the 18 miles of ice, a global civilization of organisms has been communicating through flashes of light and deep-frequency thuds for billions of years. But there is a deeper implication to this vision of the bioluminescent abyss. If life here uses light to lure prey, it implies a high level of sensory sophistication. It suggests that the organisms under the ice aren't just passive microbes. They are active, calculating hunters. They have developed a way to exploit the one thing that should be impossible in this ocean: visibility. When we look at those red lineae on the surface and see the chemical exhalations of the ocean, we are only seeing the waste products of this massive glowing factory. We are looking at the smoke from a fire we cannot see. The carbon dioxide detected in the chaos terrain of Terra Regio is the ghost of a respiratory cycle that began 100 kilometers below your feet, in a world where light is a weapon of the dark. Think about the psychological trigger of this environment. You are in a place of unknown depth, extreme isolation, and total darkness. And yet, everywhere you look, there are lights. These lights aren't friendly. They are the beacons of a predator that has mastered its environment. The Law Vault describes this as the false heaven of the abyss, a place that looks beautiful and inviting until you realize that you are the only thing in the room that doesn't understand the rules of the hunt. The organisms here don't need eyes to see you. They sense your movement through the vibrations in the water and the chemical wake of your presence. They use their bioluminescence to create a grid of light, a sensory net that allows them to map the abyss without ever needing a single ray of sun. This leads us to the realization that Europa is the scariest moon, not because it is dead, but because it is too active in a way we cannot comprehend. The serpentinization process provides a stable, long-term foundation for life that doesn't rely on the whims of a star. It is a world that could outlive the Earth. When our sun eventually expands and boils away our oceans, the abyss of Europa will still be warm. It will still be dark, and the bioluminescent lures will still be flickering in the 100-kilometer deep, waiting for something to swim toward the light. The something living under the ice isn't a fluke. It is the master of a system that is more permanent than our own. As you prepare to leave the seafloor and ascend back toward the ice, the lights of the black smokers begin to fade into the distance. But the listening phenomena we discussed in the earlier chapters takes on a new, terrifying context. Those rhythmic thuds you heard through the ice, they weren't just geology. In a world where bioluminescence is the language of the deep, those thuds are the drumbeat of the hunt. They are the sounds of something enormous moving through the darkness, guided by the full stars of the seafloor. The bioluminescent abyss is just the kitchen of the moon, the place where the energy is harvested. But the real hunters, They aren't huddling around the vents. They are out there in the open water, waiting between the lights. Europa is a world that has replaced the sky with a ceiling and the sun with a chemical fire. It is a world where perfection on the surface hides a chaotic, glowing nightmare below. And as we look at the plumes erupting into space, we have to ask, what if those plumes aren't just water? What if they are the debris of an ecosystem that is so crowded, so pressurized, and so full of life that it is literally bursting at the seams? We aren't just looking for a microbe. We are looking at a world that is charged with a predatory intelligence that has been refined in the dark for 4 billion years. But light and chemicals are only half the story. To understand what is truly moving in the great dark, we have to talk about the scale of the hunters themselves. Because in an ocean 100 kilometers deep, with low gravity and billions of years of stability, the size of life is no longer limited by the rules of Earth. In the next chapter, we are going to confront the ultimate nightmare of the lore vault, the Leviathans of Europa. We're going to find out what happens when the apex predators of the dark grow to a size that would make a blue whale look like a minnow. We're going into the territory of the giants. Now we leave the warmth of the hydrothermal vents and the neon forests of the seafloor to enter the most terrifying region of this moon, the open water of the great dark. We've spent so much time talking about the 18-mile ceiling and the rocky seafloor, but we often forget the sheer volume of the space in between. Imagine yourself suspended in the exact center of that 100-kilometer deep ocean. Above you is 50 kilometers of pressurized salt water, capped by a lid of granite-hard ice. Below you is another 50 kilometers of abyss. On Earth, the deepest point in our entire ocean, the Mariana Trench, is a mere 11 kilometers down. If you were to take that trench, the most extreme, crushing environment our planet has to offer, and stack it on top of itself nearly 10 times, you would finally reach the scale of the world you're currently floating in. This is an environment of unknown depth and extreme isolation, a place that contains more liquid water than all of Earth's oceans combined. And it is here that we must confront the second major theory from the lore vault, the existence of the Leviathans. For decades, the scientific community has played it safe, suggesting that if anything lives on Europa, it must be small, primitive, and microscopic. We've conditioned ourselves to look for Earth-like microbes huddling for warmth around chemical vents. But the lore vault suggests we are making a massive mistake in our assumptions of scale. If an ocean is 100 kilometers deep, stable for 4 billion years, and constantly being pumped full of oxygen from a surface conveyor belt, why would life stay small? On Earth, the size of our marine life is limited by two things: the availability of food and the brutal reality of gravity. But on Europa, those rules are fundamentally rewritten. Europa has significantly lower gravity than Earth, which means the physical structural limits that prevent a whale from growing to the size of a city are weakened. In this 100-kilometer water column, this something under the ice has had eons to grow into what the lore vault calls large predator life forms, apex predators of the dark that would make a great white shark look like a minnow. Visualize one of these leviathans moving through the center of the column. It doesn't look like anything from our world because it has never seen a ray of light in its entire evolutionary history. Drawing from Theory 2, These are whale-sized or even squid-like creatures adapted to extreme pressure and total darkness. They don't have eyes because eyes are a waste of biological energy in a world where sight doesn't exist. Instead, their entire bodies are covered in a complex network of vibration-sensitive nerves. They don't see you. They feel the rhythmic displacement of water as you move. They feel the electrical hum of your equipment as a shout in the dark. While we are busy looking for biosignatures in plumes, these creatures are likely using sonar so powerful it could shatter the very probes we send to find them. The horror of the Leviathan theory is the realization of just how much room they have to hide. On Earth, life is concentrated in the top few hundred meters of the ocean where the sun can reach. But on Europa, the entire 100-kilometer column is a habitable, biological supersystem. There is no surface to swim to, and the seafloor is a distant, glowing memory. These predators inhabit a three-dimensional void of unimaginable scale. They are the masters of a closed system that has existed in isolation for longer than complex life has existed on Earth. While we worry about whether or not a microbe can survive the radiation of Jupiter, these leviathans are thriving in a pressurized sanctuary, protected by an 18-mile shield of ice that we cannot easily break. Think about the psychological trigger of this unknown depth. On Earth, when you swim in the ocean, you can always look up and see the light. You know where the world is. But on Europa, if you're in the middle of that 100-kilometer drop, there is no up. Direction loses its meaning. You are suspended in a salty, conductive medium that is being constantly kneaded and stretched by the gravity of Jupiter. This gravitational friction keeps the water liquid, but it also creates a constant, low-frequency hum that the leviathans likely use as a global navigation system. They are the apex predators of the dark, and they have had 4 billion years of stability to refine the art of the hunt. The something under the ice isn't just a microbe, it is a predator that has mastered an environment completely disconnected from human experience. While we send the Europa clipper to scan the ice with radar and taste the plumes of vapor, the leviathans are moving through a 100-kilometer abyss that we have no way of seeing. They are the reason Europa feels scary. Not because the moon is dead, but because the scale of its life might be so much larger than our own. We are looking for a spark, but we might be walking on the roof of a world filled with giants. And if the law vault is correct, these creatures aren't just swimming in the dark. They are waiting. The isolation of Europa's ocean has created a paradox. It is one of the most promising environments for life, yet it is one of the most inaccessible places in the universe. We look at the polished mirror of the surface and see a peaceful, frozen pearl. But beneath that mirror, the 100-kilometer abyss is a churning, active theatre of evolution. If Theory 2 is true, the shouts and rhythmic thuds we discussed in earlier chapters aren't just shifting ice. They are the acoustic signatures of something massive shifting its weight in the dark. They are the sounds of a hunt that's been going on since before the first dinosaurs walked on Earth. This is the terror of the leviathans, the realization that we are arriving billions of years late to a world that already has its own masters. We are the intruders. We are the ones who don't understand the rules of the 100-kilometer deep. While we plan our landing and our drilling, the apex predators below are already listening to the vibrations of our curiosity. They don't need sunlight to find us. They don't need eyes to see our probes. They only need the water to carry the message that we are finally here. Europa is the scariest moon because it challenges our place in the food chain. It tells us that in the dark, in the deep, and under the ice, size and intelligence might look very different than they do in the sun. As we prepare to finally knock on the door of this hidden world, we have to ask ourselves if we are truly ready to face the things that have grown enormous in the absence of light. Because once we break the mirror, we aren't just finding life, we are entering the territory of the Leviathans. And in an ocean 10 times deeper than our own, there's a lot of room for things to hide, and even more room for us to be lost. We've spoken of the giants in the dark and the bioluminescent lures that dance on the seafloor, but now we must confront a possibility that is far more unsettling. To many, the idea of life under the ice stops at biology, at the thought of mindless predators and chemical drinking microbes. But there is a fringe theory, a whisper in the most obscure corners of planetary science and deep law discussions that suggests we're looking for the wrong thing. It is called the subsurface civilization hypothesis. It asks us to consider a haunting question. If you had an environment that was stable for 4 billion years, protected from every catastrophe that has ever struck the surface of our solar system, would life just stop at being animals? Or would the abyss eventually produce an intelligence, a shadow civilization that has been thriving in the dark while we were still crawling out of the mud? Today we are looking at the ultimate mystery of Europa. We aren't just looking for life, we are looking for a neighbour that may have been watching us from beneath the floor for eons. To understand why this theory carries such weight, we have to look at the history of our own planet. Earth is a chaotic, violent place. In the last 500 million years alone, our world has been hit by 5 major mass extinction events. Asteroids the size of cities have slammed into our oceans. Supervolcanoes have choked the atmosphere with ash for centuries. The very climate of our planet has swung from a hothouse to a snowball Earth and back again. Every time life on Earth gets a foothold, the universe tries to kill it. But Europa is different. Beneath that 29-kilometer shield of ice, the ocean is the ultimate planetary bomb shelter. While the surface of the moon is a radioactive hellscape, the water below is shielded, stable, and warm. It has existed in a state of near-perfect equilibrium for 4 billion years. Think about that time frame. 4 billion years of a closed, protected system. On Earth, it took less than 4 billion years to go from a single-celled organism to a species that can build rockets and split the atom. If the conditions on Europa are as stable as the Juno data suggests, there is no reason to believe that intelligence hasn't already emerged in the Great Dark. This is the core argument of the shadow civilization. While Earth was suffering through ice ages and asteroid impacts, the abyss of Europa was silent and consistent. Any intelligence that evolved there wouldn't have to worry about mass extinctions. They wouldn't have to worry about their atmosphere being stripped away or their sun going nova. They are protected by 18 miles of granite-hard ice, a fortress that the rest of the universe cannot penetrate. This creates a paradox of development. On Earth, we look to the stars for answers because we have a horizon, we have a sky, we have a beyond. But for a civilization on Europa, the universe ends at the ceiling. Their entire history, their entire philosophy and their entire technological path would be built around the reality of a world without light. They wouldn't build telescopes, they would build acoustic arrays. They wouldn't master fire, they would master chemical gradients and electromagnetic pulses. They would be a shadow civilization, an intelligence that has perfected the art of living in the one place we are the most terrified to enter. But this leads us to the psychological trigger that makes this moon so scary: the choice. If an advanced civilization exists beneath the ice, why haven't they contacted us? Why is the moon so silent? The law vault suggests two possibilities, and both are chilling. The first is that they simply don't know we exist. To an intelligence living in a 100-kilometer deep dark tank, the idea of a surface or an outer space might be as alien as the concept of a fourth dimension is to us. They might view the 18-mile ice shell as a permanent, solid boundary to the universe. They aren't looking for us because they believe they are the only thing in existence. But the second possibility is much worse. They know exactly where we are, and they are choosing to hide. Consider the listening phenomena we discussed earlier. If you are a civilization that relies on acoustics and vibration to navigate your world, you are incredibly sensitive to the environment. The moment our spacecraft, the Galileos, the Junos, the Voyagers, began to orbit Jupiter, they began to broadcast signals. Every time we send a probe to taste a plume or bounce radar off the ice, we are essentially knocking on their front door. If there is an intelligence under that ice, they have been listening to us for decades. They have heard the rhythmic thuds of our curiosity, and they've made a choice. In a universe where the surface is a radioactive wasteland of death, any intelligence would be naturally inclined toward extreme caution. They wouldn't look for us. They would view our arrival as an intrusion from a world that shouldn't even be able to support life. To them, we aren't neighbours. We are monsters from a world of light and fire, breaking through the ceiling of their sanctuary. This is why the subsurface civilization hypothesis feels so personal. It changes Europa from a scientific target into a mirror. When we look at those red lineae and those plumes of water vapour, we aren't just looking at geological vents. We might be looking at the exhaust ports of a global society we cannot comprehend. The carbon dioxide detected by the James Webb Space Telescope in regions like Terra Regio might not just be a sign of biology. It could be the chemical footprint of an industry or an urban centre that exists 100 kilometres below the surface. We call it chaos terrain because the ice looks broken and disordered, but from the perspective of the abyss, those might be the only places where their world can breathe into the vacuum. The isolation of Europa is the ultimate shield for a shadow civilization. On Earth, we are constantly broadcasting our presence into the void through radio waves and light. We are a loud planet, but Europa is a silent world because the ice blocks everything. No radio waves can escape 18 miles of frozen salt water. No light can penetrate the ceiling. They are the perfect shadow, existing right in our backyard, potentially more advanced than us, yet completely invisible to every telescope we have ever built. They don't need to build a cloaking device. The moon did it for them 4 billion years ago. As you think about this, you have to confront the reality of our current missions. NASA's Europa Clipper is on its way, carrying 9 scientific instruments designed to peer through the ice. We are approaching this world with the confidence of explorers, thinking we are going to find a few microbes in a plume. But if the shadow civilization theory is even partially true, we are doing something much more dangerous. We are breaking the silence of a world that has enjoyed 4 billion years of peace. We are the alien invasion that the inhabitants of the abyss have been dreading since they first developed the ability to listen. The something that lives under the ice might not be a creature driven by instinct. It might be a mind driven by a history that makes ours look like a brief, chaotic footnote. Europa is the scariest moon because it represents a world that has mastered survival in a way we never could. It has turned isolation into a fortress. It has turned darkness into a home. And as we prepare to finally peer through the polished mirror and sample the plumes, we have to ask ourselves if we are ready to meet an intelligence that has never seen a star. Because if we find them, we won't just be discovering life. We will be discovering that we are the ones who have been living in the dark all along. The shadow civilization isn't hiding from the universe. They are simply living in the only part of it that is safe. And soon, for better or worse, we are going to walk onto their roof and start making noise. The question isn't just, are we alone? The question is, do we really want to know who is beneath us? Because in an ocean that is 10 times deeper than our own, under a ceiling that never breaks, there is plenty of room for a civilization to grow, and even more room for us to be forgotten. The abyss is waiting, the ice is thinning, and the shadows are starting to move. For decades, we have looked at the 18-mile ice ceiling of Europa as an impenetrable fortress, a granite-hard barrier that keeps the secrets of the abyss locked away from the eyes of humanity. We've spent hours debating how we could ever hope to drill through such a colossal shield, worrying that the biological lock-in would seal any probe into a permanent, frozen tomb before we could ever see what lies beneath. But in the cold silence of space, Europa has started to do something unexpected. It has started to breathe. While we were busy trying to figure out how to break in, the moon was already breaking out. Today we are looking at the message in the plumes, the moments when the internal pressure of a 100-kilometer deep ocean becomes so intense that the moon literally exhales its contents into the vacuum of space. We aren't just looking at geological vents, we are looking at the only way we might ever taste the abyss without being trapped inside it. And as NASA's Europa Clipper hurtles toward this frozen world, we have to ask, what happens if the first thing we catch in the spray isn't just salt, but a piece of the something that lives below? The first real hint that Europa was leaking didn't come from a probe on the surface, but from a distant, unblinking eye in orbit around Earth. In 2012, the Hubble Space Telescope captured images that fundamentally changed our understanding of this moon. Near the South Pole, Hubble detected faint, ghostly columns of water vapor erupting from the surface and rising 200 kilometers into the blackness of space. To put that in perspective, these plumes are reaching altitudes twice as high as the boundary of Earth's atmosphere. They are massive, intermittent shouts of water and chemicals from an ocean that has been sealed for 4 billion years. This discovery suggested that the 18-mile ceiling is not a solid, static wall. It is a system under pressure, a planetary-scale vessel that occasionally ruptures, sending the hidden contents of the abyss directly into the firing line of our sensors. But as scientists began to celebrate the Hubble discovery, a haunting realization set in. We might have already touched the plumes without even knowing it. In 2018, researchers returned to the data sent back by the Galileo spacecraft over 20 years earlier. In 1997, Galileo made a daring flyby that brought it within just 206 kilometers of Europa's surface. At the time, the data it sent back was a confusing mess of anomalies, sudden unexplained shifts in the magnetic field, and sharp spikes in plasma density. For 2 decades, these signals sat in our archives like a ghost in the machine. But when we applied the plume hypothesis to that old data, the puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying precision. Galileo hadn't just observed a plume from a distance, it had flown directly through one. It had spent 3 minutes bathed in the exhalations of a hidden world, sampling a 100-kilometer deep ocean while we were still trying to prove it existed. This is the leak, and it is our greatest opportunity. If these plumes are real, and the evidence from Hubble, Galileo, and now the James Webb Space Telescope says they are, then Europa is not a closed box. It is an active, breathing organism that is offering us samples of its own interior. The mechanics of these plumes are driven by the same monster's grip we discussed in earlier chapters. As Jupiter's gravity kneads the Moon, the pressure in the 100-kilometer deep ocean builds until it finds a weakness in the lineae, the red fractured veins of the surface. The water is forced upward through the 18-mile lid, vaporizing as it hits the vacuum of space, carrying with it the salts, minerals, and organic compounds of the dark abyss. This brings us to the taste, the mission that could change everything. On October 14th, 2024, NASA launched Europa Clipper, a spacecraft designed with a single, obsessive purpose: to understand the habitability of this moon. When it arrives at Jupiter in 2030, Clipper won't attempt a suicidal landing on the radioactive surface. Instead, it will perform 49 close flybys, some swooping as low as 25 kilometers from the frozen plains. It is carrying a suite of 9 scientific instruments, including mass spectrometers that act like a digital tongue. If the plumes are active when Clipper passes through, it will taste the ocean directly. It will scan for the chemical signatures of the bioluminescent abyss and the waste products of the oxygen conveyor belt. But here is where the storytelling becomes a nightmare. If the leviathans of Theory 2 are as real as the plumes, then what exactly is being ejected into space? When a plume erupts, it isn't just pure water. It is a pressurized blast from a crowded active ecosystem. We aren't just looking for salt, we're looking for biosignatures, the complex organic molecules that only life can produce. In the most extreme scenarios discussed in the Law Vault, these plumes could contain microscopic fragments of organisms or the chemical scent of a shadow civilization that lives 100 kilometers below. We are sending a machine to fly through a cloud of ocean spray that originated in a world we are not built to explore, hoping to find a message from an intelligence we might not be ready to understand. The psychological trigger of the message in the plumes is the realization that we no longer need to break the mirror to see what's behind it. Europa is opening itself to us. But an opening is not always an invitation. In many cultures, a leak in a pressurized system is a warning of an impending collapse. If the moon is breathing out its secrets, it means the internal pressure of that dark ocean is higher than we ever imagined. It means the system is not just active, it is overflowing. Every plume that Hubble sees is a reminder that the 18-mile ceiling is the only thing keeping a 100-kilometer deep, oxygen-fed abyss from spilling into the solar system. As Europa Clipper draws closer to its destination, the stakes couldn't be higher. If the taste reveals nothing but sterile salt water, it might mean that life is an incredibly rare accident, unique to our own blue marble. But if we find even a single complex organic chain, even the faintest scent of something biological, it means the universe is not the empty graveyard we feared. It means that right next door, in our own backyard, a world has developed in total darkness, thriving on the friction of a gravitational monster and the radiation of a gas giant. We are arriving at a threshold. We are no longer just guessing about what lies beneath. We are preparing to intercept the moon's own testimony. The plumes are the message, and the Europa Clipper is the listener. And as the spacecraft prepares to fly through those columns of vapor, we have to prepare ourselves for the answer. Because once we taste the ocean of Europa, the silence of the solar system will be broken forever. We will know once and for all if we are truly alone, or if we have finally heard the first exhaled breath of a world that's been waiting for us in the dark for 4 billion years. The plumes are rising, the polished mirror is leaking, and in 2030 we will finally know what it tastes like to touch the abyss. But as we move toward the final chapter of this journey, we have to look past the chemistry and the plumes. We have to look at the ultimate question. If we find them, and if they have been there all along, what does it mean for our place in the stars? Are we ready to confront the final secret of the moon that refuses to stay still? We've travelled across the vast, frozen plains of the polished mirror, felt the rhythmic thuds of the internal kneading of a world under torture, and peered into the chemical plumes that offer a taste of a dark, salty abyss. But as our journey concludes, we find ourselves back where we started, standing on a surface that refuses to reveal its face, staring up at the monster planet that provides the energy for a world we may never be allowed to touch. This brings us to the final and perhaps most disturbing realization in the entire solar system. Long before we had the technology to even imagine drilling through 18 miles of ice, a visionary named Arthur C. Clarke offered a prophecy that feels more like a survival manual than a work of fiction. He wrote, "All these worlds are yours, except Europa. Attempt no landing there." For decades we took that as a challenge, but as we've peeled back the layers of this moon, we have to ask ourselves if it was actually a warning. Perhaps some doors in the universe were never meant to be opened. Today we are facing the ultimate psychological threshold. If we finally break that mirror and look into the darkness, are we ready for the answer that is waiting for us? To understand the weight of Clarke's warning, you have to look at the geometry of Europa one last time. Every other world we have explored is open to the stars. On Mars, you can look up and see Earth as a pale blue dot. On our moon, you can walk across the craters and feel the gaze of the entire cosmos. But Europa is a closed system, a trapped volume of water that has existed in total isolation for longer than complex life has existed on Earth. This 18-mile thick lid of ice isn't just a physical distance, it is a statement of ownership. It tells us that whatever is happening in that 100-kilometer deep abyss belongs entirely to that world. It has its own history, its own chemical language, and its own evolutionary path that has never been influenced by a single ray of sunlight. When we talk about landing there, we aren't just talking about a scientific mission, we are talking about a trespass. We are preparing to invade the only sanctuary in the solar system that has remained perfectly, pristinely alone for 4 billion years. This isolation is what creates the first half of our final question. If we find life, even a single microbial organism, feeding on chemical energy in the dark, it changes the fundamental story of our existence. It would mean that life is not a rare accident, not a miracle tied specifically to the blue skies and warm sun of Earth, but a natural process of the universe. It would mean that wherever you have water, energy and time, the universe will find a way to breathe. In that moment, we would no longer be alone. The crushing weight of cosmic loneliness that has defined human philosophy for thousands of years would vanish, but in its place, a new kind of fear would emerge. Because if life happened twice in one solar system, then the universe is not a graveyard. It is a crowded, active, and competitive theatre of existence. Finding life on Europa doesn't just give us a neighbour, it gives us a competitor for the truth of what the universe is actually for. But there is a darker side to that discovery. If we find that the something under the ice is complex, predatory, or even intelligent, we have to face the second half of the question. Have we found a world that we were never meant to enter? Think about the biological lock-in we discussed. Europa is a self-healing world that consumes its own history. It guards its ocean behind a radioactive hellscape that shreds the very DNA of anything that tries to approach it. It mutes the sound of its internal abyss with 18 miles of granite-hard ice. These are not the features of an inviting world. These are the defences of a world that wants to remain a mystery. If we force our way through that lid, we are breaking a seal that has been maintained for eons. We are introducing the chaos of our world into a place of perfect, dark equilibrium. Clarke's warning wasn't about the difficulty of the landing, it was about the consequences of the discovery. It was about the realization that once we touch that water, we can never take it back. We will have permanently altered the only world in the solar system that was truly perfectly separate from us. This is the psychological dread of the ocean we cannot see. It is the realization that the abyss of Europa is an absence of knowledge, and in that absence, our imagination fills the gaps with monsters. We imagine the leviathans, the shadow civilizations, and the bioluminescent lures because we cannot handle the silence. But the true horror might not be what is there. It might be the fact that we can never truly know it without destroying it. We are not built to explore this. We are creatures of the light, of the air, and of the surface. We are intruders in a 100-kilometer deep dark tank where direction has no meaning and the stars don't exist. The dread comes from the understanding that even if we send our probes and our cryobots, we will only ever be looking at fragments of a story we aren't part of. We are arriving billions of years late to a world that has already decided what it is. As the Europa Clipper hurtles toward its 2030 arrival, we are moving toward a collision with our own assumptions. We are hoping for a yes or a no to the question of life, but we are ignoring the possibility of a go away. If the plumes we taste contain the evidence of a world that is active and alive, we have to decide what to do with that information. Do we continue to push, to drill, and to invade, or do we respect the barrier that the universe has so clearly placed between us? Clarke's warning suggests that some thresholds should not be crossed, that some mirrors should not be broken. Because if Europa is a cage, then unlocking the door doesn't just let us in, it lets the truth of that abyss out. And once the silence is broken by understanding, the mystery that has protected this moon for 4 billion years will be gone forever. The scariest thing about Europa isn't the radiation, the ice, or the potential for giant predators. It is the reflection we see in its polished surface. It is a world that shows us how much we don't know and how little we are prepared for what we might find. It is a moon that remains smooth and perfect, while the rest of the solar system is battered and scarred, as if it is refusing to be part of the violence of our history. When we look at Europa, we are looking at the ultimate other, a place so disconnected from human experience that it forces us to question everything we believe about our place in the stars. Whether we find a barren, salty wasteland or a thriving, glowing empire of the deep, the answer will be uncomfortable, because it will tell us that we are either more alone than we ever feared, or that we are merely small, fragile observers on the roof of a world that has no need for our sun. So as we wait for the first data to return from the plumes, as we listen for the rhythmic thuds that might be a response to our presence, we have to sit with the dread of the invisible. We have to confront the reality that the something under the ice has been there since the dawn of time, waiting in a darkness we cannot fathom. And as we prepare to take that final step, to attempt the landing that Clarke warned us against, we have to ask the only question that truly matters. When we finally look through the glass and we see what has been growing in the dark for 4 billion years, will we find a new beginning for humanity? Or will we find that we've finally reached the one place in the universe where we were never meant to be? The ocean is waiting, the ice is thinning, and the warning is still ringing in the silence. All these worlds are yours, except Europa. And soon we are going to find out why. We are standing at the edge of a discovery that could redefine what it means to be alive. For 4 billion years, Europa has spun silently through the darkness, guarding its secrets beneath a frozen shell and waiting for us to finally knock on its door. We've looked at the fractured mirror of its surface. We've heard the rhythmic thuds of its internal agony, and we've imagined the bioluminescent giants that might call its 100-kilometer abyss home. But the most terrifying part of this story isn't the radiation, the ice, or the monsters. It's the uncertainty. Whether the ocean of Europa is a barren, salty wasteland or a thriving empire of the deep, the answer will change the way we see the stars forever. If we find life there, the universe is no longer an empty graveyard. It is a place filled with possibility, hidden in the dark, far from the warmth of any sun. But if we find only silence, we are forced to confront the chilling reality that Earth might be a singular, fragile accident in a cold and indifferent cosmos. Right now, NASA's Europa Clipper is hurtling toward this icy world, carrying the instruments that might finally let us hear the message in the plumes. By 2030, the silence will finally be broken, and the ocean we cannot see will be forced to reveal its face. Until then, Europa remains a reminder that the universe does not reveal itself easily, that its most important secrets are hidden behind layers of ice and distance, waiting for those patient enough to listen. If you're drawn to these quiet mysteries of the universe and want to be here when we finally find out what's hidden under the ice, take a moment to subscribe. Out here, the strangest worlds are still waiting to be discovered, and we're only just beginning to look. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.